On a quiet weekday morning in suburban Texas, a homeowner opens a property tax notice and sees the number that decides whether they're retiring, feels possible, or whether they'll be forced to sell. It's not the mortgage, it's the tax line. And in a state where rising appraisals have turned homeownership into a yearly cash flow test, Texas leadership is now floating a proposal that could redraw the map of who can afford to stay put, who can trade up, and who gets priced out. The plan has a nickname that sounds almost playful, Operation Double Nickel, but the implications are anything but. According to HousingWire, Texas LT. Dan Patrick is proposing to push senior school property tax benefits down from age 65 to age 55, extending the window of tax relief by a full decade and expanding eligibility for millions of homeowners. Here's the detail the market cannot ignore. According to a Texas Senate press release summarizing the proposal, it would lower the school district senior homestead exemption age from 65 to 55, potentially saving eligible homeowners close to $950 per year on average, affecting roughly 3.3 million homeowners and freezing school district taxable values starting at age 55. That freeze concept is the kind of policy lever that doesn't just reduce a bill, it changes behavior. It changes when people list, it changes whether they remodel instead of moving. It changes investor math, neighborhood turnover, and the supply pipeline that realtors, builders, lenders, and servicers rely on. And there's a second-order signal here that should raise the reader's pulse. Property tax relief is no longer a marginal political talking point in Texas. It's becoming a structural tool to stabilize or destabilize the housing market. The Texas Tribune reports that Patrick is pairing the age shift with a push to raise the homestead exemption again for school property taxes, intensifying a policy fight over who pays, who benefits, and how schools and local services get funded. If you operate in American real estate, you should treat this as both an opportunity and a threat, because once a state like Texas normalizes major property tax relief tied to age, it pressures other high-growth, high-tax regions to respond. The question is not whether this will move the market. The question is who sees the move early enough to prepare and who gets caught reacting after the rules have already changed. In American real estate, we talk about interest rates as if they are the weather, unpredictable, unavoidable, and powerful enough to change everybody's plans. But in Texas, there is another force that has been shaping the housing market with the same intensity, and sometimes with more brutality: property taxes. For millions of homeowners, the monthly mortgage payment is no longer the only test of affordability. The annual tax bill has become the line item that decides whether a family stays, downsizes, rents out a spare room, or lists a home and leaves the neighborhood entirely. That is why what Texas leaders are discussing right now deserves your full attention, not as a local political story, but as a market-moving signal that could ripple through pricing, inventory, relocation patterns, and investor strategy across the country. According to HousingWire, TexasLT.gov, Dan Patrick has rolled out Operation Double Nickel, a proposal that would lower the age for senior property tax benefits from 65 to 55, effectively extending eligibility for relief by an entire decade. And the details matter, because this is not framed as a symbolic tweak, it's being sold as a structural change to how long homeowners can shelter themselves from rising tax burdens, according to a Texas Senate press statement from Sen. Paul Betancourt's office describing the proposal. The plan would lower the school district's senior homestead exemption age from 65 to 55, reach roughly 3.3 million homeowners, and most importantly, freeze school district taxable values, beginning at age 55. The same statement says the average annual savings would be close to $950, with projected savings over a decade estimated at $16,167 for eligible homeowners who stay in place. Spectrum Local News reports the proposal also includes raising the homestead exemption by another $40,000. Layering broader relief on top of the age-based change. If you work in brokerage, lending, building, servicing, or single-family rentals, you already know what a freeze can do to behavior. It can encourage aging in place. It can discourage downsizing. It can reduce turnover. It can create a new kind of lock-in effect, not tied to mortgage rates this time, but tied to taxes. And when a market like Texas, one of the country's biggest engines of household migration, new construction, and institutional capital, starts talking about freezing taxable values a full decade earlier, it is telling you something about where the pressure has been building. The Texas Tribune notes this proposal is landing inside a broader, escalating fight over school property taxes, with Patrick pushing for a larger homestead exemption while Gov. Greg Abbott is pushing a more sweeping direction. Realtor.com reports Abbott has floated the idea of letting voters decide whether to abolish school property taxes for homeowners entirely, which underscores just how central this issue has become in Texas politics, and therefore, in Texas housing economics. In other words, this is not a theoretical policy discussion. This is a live contest over the future cost of owning a home in one of America's most important housing markets. Now, here is where the opportunity and the threat converge. On one hand, if the policy moves forward, millions of 55 to 60 for homeowners could see meaningful relief, potentially improving housing stability, lowering forced sales risk, and helping families preserve wealth at a life stage when many are balancing late career uncertainty, caregiving responsibilities, and rising insurance and medical costs. According to the Texas Senate press statement, the stated intent is long-term stability for as long as they own their home, and that has social value. Fewer displacement shocks, more continuity in communities, and more predictable household budgets. On the other hand, markets do not absorb policy shifts politely. They reprice, they reroute supply. They create winners and losers. If a large cohort is incentivized to stay put longer, inventory can tighten in the exact price bands that first-time buyers and move-up families rely on. If the savings are significant enough, sellers may raise reservation prices. If the relief is unevenly distributed across counties and school districts, you can see micromarkets diverge fast. And if Texas sets a precedent tying meaningful, durable tax advantages to age 55, other states, watching their own affordability pressures, may face demands to follow. That is how one state's proposal becomes the market's new baseline. So as you listen to this, do not treat it as a niche benefit for older homeowners. Treat it as a potential structural change to the economics of inventory, mobility, and affordability, one that could shift transaction volume, construction demand, and even the single-family rental pipeline in ways the ND market will feel long before most consumers understand what happened. If you want more documentary-style breakdowns like this where policy meets pricing and real people feel the impact hit, like, subscribe, and tell me what city and country you're watching from, because your support is what allows us to keep producing analysis that helps consumers and operators stay ahead of the next move. The first thing to understand is that this proposal is not just a tax cut. It is a behavioral policy designed to change who moves, when they move, and how long they stay anchored to a property. If Texas lowers the senior school property tax benefit age from 65 to 55 and freezes school district taxable values starting at 55, that effectively creates a new affordability floor for a huge cohort right at the moment. Many households are reassessing work, health, caregiving, and retirement timelines. According to a Texas Senate press statement describing Operation Double Nickel, the plan would lower the ISD senior homestead exemption age from 65 to 55, save nearly $950 per year for roughly 3.3 million homeowners, and freeze ISD taxable values beginning at age 55. For real estate professionals, the immediate implication is inventory. The U.S. housing market has been fighting a lock-in problem for years. Homeowners reluctant to sell because their existing mortgage rate is far below current market rates. That lock-in has been documented in hard numbers. According to a Federal Reserve working paper, mortgage rate lock-in explains a large share of the decline in borrower mobility after rates rose, with one Fed analysis estimating lock-in accounted for 44% of the drop in mortgage borrower mobility from 2021 to 2022. And the Federal Housing Finance Agency has quantified the behavioral sensitivity even more sharply. According to an FHFA working paper, for every 1 percentage point that market mortgage rates exceed a borrower's origination rate, the probability of sale decreases by about 18.1%. Now take that same lock-in concept and add a second chain. If you freeze taxable value at 55, you are effectively telling homeowners, the longer you stay, the more valuable your tax position becomes compared with a move into a reappraised property. This is not theoretical. America has already run this experiment in other forms. California's Proposition 13, enacted in 1978, limited property tax growth and created powerful incentives to remain in place. According to an MBER Digest summarizing research on Proposition 13, tenure length increased meaningfully in high appreciation. Coastal areas with average tenure rising by more than 2 years in the Los Angeles area, and by 3 years in the Bay Area between 1970 and 2000. Evidence consistent with a tax-driven lock-in effect. The market lesson is blunt. When you attach substantial, durable tax advantages to staying put, you can reduce turnover in the places where demand pressure is highest. Then turnover is the lifeblood of transaction volume. That is the core threat for operators who depend on predictable listings flow. If a 55-year-old homeowner in Austin, Dallas, or Houston believes selling means losing a frozen taxable value and stepping into a higher tax basis, the seller's reservation price rises. They need a bigger reason to move, and they will demand more money to justify it. In practice, that can tighten resale supply in exactly the mid-market and move-up segments that already struggle with thin inventory. It can also shift behavior toward renovations and additions, because when people feel tax secure, they invest in the home they already have instead of turning the keys over to the next buyer. But there is also an opportunity hidden inside the same mechanism, and it matters for anyone advising consumers. In a high appreciation, high tax environment, property taxes can become a form of displacement pressure, especially for households with fixed or slowly growing income. A policy that reduces that pressure can stabilize communities and reduce forced sales. That is why this proposal is being framed as a relief valve. According to HousingWire's reporting on Operation Double Nickel, the plan aims to lower the age for senior property tax benefits from 65 to 55 and expand exemptions, with advocates arguing it could materially reduce tax burden during the decade before traditional retirement age. The social upside is real. Fewer households pushed out by rising tax bills, more continuity for older homeowners supporting adult children, or caring for parents, and a longer runway to build equity without the annual fear that the tax bill will spike beyond reach. Still, markets do not grant free lunches. If one group's carrying costs are reduced and their incentive to sell declines, the affordability burden can shift onto the next buyers, especially first-time buyers and relocating workers who do not have a frozen tax base to protect. That is how a consumer-friendly policy can quietly become an inventory constraint. And Texas is not a small test case. This is one of the most consequential migration and construction theaters in the country, and the politics indicate the pressure is escalating. A Houston Chronicle report describes how this proposal is part of a broader high-stakes fight over property tax relief, noting that Texas has already committed about $51 billion, roughly a quarter of its budget, toward property tax relief while leaders debate competing approaches to deeper cuts. This is where the urgency comes in. If you are a broker, lender, builder, or investor, you cannot wait until the final legislative language is set to model the impact. You need scenarios now. What happens to listings in zip codes with high concentrations of 55 to 64 homeowners? What happens to price elasticity when a meaningful share of owners receive an embedded annual savings and a tax basis shield? What happens to SFR acquisition strategies when aging in place extends by years? These are not academic questions. They determine whether you underwrite for scarcity or for turnover, whether you stock pipeline, assuming normal churn, or recognize that policy can harden supply even when rates eventually ease. And there is one more historical parallel that should keep you alert. When policymakers create mobility friction, they often have to create a second policy later to undo the friction. California S. Proposition 19 is a modern example of that political physics designed in part to make property tax bases more portable for certain groups, including homeowners over 55, to reduce the lock-in created by older rules. According to reporting by the San Francisco Chronicle, Prop 19 increased the number of tax-based transfers for eligible movers in the Bay Area compared with prior years, underscoring that lawmakers sometimes end up designing release valves when lock-in becomes too economically costly. If Texas creates a strong tax lock-in at 55, the market should be prepared for the next chapter of policy debate: portability, carve-outs, and new exemptions that can once again reshuffle demand and supply. So the warning to the market is simple. This proposal, if it advances, could create a two-layer lock-in: mortgage rate lock-in for some homeowners, tax basis lock-in for others, and that combination can squeeze inventory in ways that feel like a sudden shortage, even when demand is not exploding. The opportunity is equally direct for the households who qualify. It can reduce displacement risk and support wealth stability at a stage of life where a single cost shock can unravel a decade of planning. The operators who win will be the ones who treat this as a structural shift in mobility incentives, not as a headline about seniors, and not as a generic promise of lower taxes. The second thing the market has to confront is that tax relief at this scale is never just a homeowner story. It is a financing story, a public services story, and most importantly for real estate operators, a story about who ultimately carries the cost of affordability when one segment is insulated. Texas is already deep into the mechanics of large property tax relief. According to the Houston Chronicle, lawmakers allocated about $51 billion to property tax relief in the current budget, roughly a quarter of the state's total spending, and that number alone signals how politically and fiscally central the issue has become. Realtor.com has described the broader relief package around 2025 as historic, noting estimates that typical homeowners could see savings in the neighborhood of $500 a year if voters approve measures tied to that cycle. And it is not just talk. Axios reported that Texas voters approved a package of constitutional amendments on November 4, 2025, including raising the school district homestead exemption to $140,000 for homeowners. Among other tax-related changes, now place Operation Double Nickel on top of that existing architecture. According to the Texas Senate press statement describing the proposal, the plan would expand school property tax protections by lowering the senior homestead exemption age from 65 to 55 and freezing school district taxable values starting at 55, with estimated average savings of nearly $950 per year. This is where the real estate market has to stop thinking in election cycle soundbites and start thinking in second-order effects. A policy that reduces the carrying cost of ownership for a large cohort will likely increase their willingness to hold. And when a cohort holds longer, it reduces the natural recycling of inventory that keeps neighborhoods liquid. But the most underappreciated risk is what happens in the places where holding already costs more than people realize. In many Texas metros, the pressure point is no longer just rate shock. It is the combined burden of taxes, insurance. Realtor.com reported Abbott has floated letting voters decide whether to eliminate school property taxes for homeowners entirely. A proposal that, if it ever became law, would represent a fundamental restructuring of how public education is financed in Texas. And once you start talking about restructuring school property taxes, you are talking about stability, not just relief. Even the promise of relief can change expectations in the market. Consumers begin to delay decisions, waiting for a better deal. Sellers become more confident that carrying costs will ease, making them less inclined to accept discounts. Investors begin to model policy upside into valuations, especially for single-family rental portfolios, where property taxes are one of the largest operating expenses. The result can be a dangerous cocktail: reduced urgency to sell among owner-occupants, increased pricing confidence, and a shortage of move-in-ready listings at the exact moment younger households are trying to form families and compete for stable housing. The fiscal side matters because it determines whether relief is durable or temporary. One reason this should feel urgent to professionals is that markets punish uncertainty. If relief depends on future surpluses or shifting state priorities, you can end up with a housing market that prices in permanent savings while the public finance base is still debating how to pay for them. The Houston Chronicle summarized the competing visions in mid-December 2025. Reporting Abbott's push for eliminating school property taxes and Patrick's alternative path, and noting the political stakes of how such plans would be funded. Kara News also reported that Abbott's camp is pairing the tax relief message with proposals to enact tighter restrictions on how much property values can grow and to make it harder for local governments to raise property taxes, while Patrick has opposed lowering appraisal caps, arguing in effect that certain caps can distort markets. Appraisal caps are where history starts to rhyme in ways real estate should not ignore. If you cap taxable value growth tightly enough, you create the perception of stability for existing owners, but you also risk creating bigger discontinuities at the moment of sale, and you can shift burdens in ways that reduce market efficiency. The Houston Chronicle reported Abbott's proposals include capping annual appraisal increases at 3% for all properties and moving to mandatory appraisals every 5 years rather than annually. The Texas Tribune has warned through its reporting that such tighter caps can have unintended consequences, with tax policy experts flagging the trade-offs and potential distortions of putting a tighter lid on home values for tax purposes. For operators, the point is not to pick a political side. It is to recognize what these policies do to incentives. Caps, freezes, and expanded exemptions are all forms of friction. They reduce the speed at which housing stock turns over. Friction is the enemy of liquidity. You have seen this movie before in other states, and the market learned the hard way that the social benefits can be real while the liquidity costs can be punishing. California's Proposition 13 is the classic case study. The MBER has summarized research finding that Proposition 13 substantially increased household tenure compared with other states, reinforcing continuity and stability, but also strengthening lock-in dynamics. That stability is not nothing. Stability means fewer forced moves, fewer disrupted school years for children, fewer older households losing their footing because a bill rose faster than their income. In Texas, moving the freeze window down to 55 could translate into something tangible: a decade where homeowners can plan caregiving, retirement, and employment transitions with less fear that taxes will push them out. But here is the market-facing warning: the benefits tend to concentrate on those already inside the ownership gate. And when policy leans hard into protecting existing owners, it can leave new buyers exposed to scarcity and higher entry prices. The industry has to be candid about that. If listings tighten because older owners are encouraged to stay, then first-time buyers and workforce households pay the price through competition and concessions. If local revenue pressure rises, municipalities may compensate through other fees or bonds, which can show up in assessments, utility costs, and the cost of doing business for developers. If school funding becomes a larger state obligation, then the fight shifts to the state budget, meaning real estate fundamentals can become more sensitive to political cycles than they already are. So the opportunity in this second chapter is social and strategic. If you are advising consumers, you can help 55-260 for homeowners understand how relief could stabilize their budget and reduce displacement risk. If you are building products, services, or acquisition strategies, you can position around a market where holding periods lengthen and turnover slows, more renovations, more aging in place modifications, more home equity planning, and a different rhythm to resale inventory. The threat is equally direct. If you underwrite Texas like a high-churn growth market without factoring in policy-driven lock-in, you can misprice risk, overestimate transaction volume, and get caught when the supply you assumed would appear simply does not. And the urgency is this: the policy conversation is not cooling down, it is accelerating. Between Operation Double Nickel, the push to raise the homestead exemption again, and competing visions that even include eliminating school property taxes for homeowners, Texas is signaling that property taxes are not a background variable. Anymore, they are becoming a primary driver of housing behavior. What Texas is putting on the table right now is not a technical adjustment that only CPAs should care about. It is a potential rewrite of housing behavior in one of the country's most systemically important growth markets. And the industry should treat it with the same seriousness it reserves for a major Fed pivot. If Operation Double Nickel moves forward as described, it would lower the school district senior homestead exemption age from 65 to 55. Freeze school district taxable values beginning at 55 and is being promoted as saving nearly $950 per year for roughly 3.3 million homeowners, an embedded advantage that lasts as long as the homeowner holds the property. That single design choice, freezing taxable value, earlier turns the home into something more than shelter and more than an investment. It turns the home into a protected tax position. And once you create a protected position, you change incentives. Owners who might have downsized at 60 may decide to stay until 70. Families who might have sold to move closer to adult children may remodel instead. Investors underwriting scattered-site single-family rentals may see operating cost stability for a slice of the market, but they may also face tighter acquisition supply because fewer owner-occupants are motivated to list. This is why the market has to stay in front of the policy curve, not behind it. The second conclusion is that Texas is signaling something broader. Property taxes are now being treated as an affordability crisis lever on the same level as interest rates. Now the lessons, and they are practical. The first is for consumer operators agents, loan officers, and housing counselors. Do not let your clients experience this as a headline. Turn it into a scenario. Run side-by-side ownership cost projections that separate mortgage payment from property taxes and show what a taxable value freeze could mean. Over a 10-year horizon, especially for households approaching 55, use this to reduce panic and to reduce misinformation. Because policies like this attract rumors that can cause people to delay transactions unnecessarily or make fear-driven decisions. The second lesson is for brokers and teams managing pipeline. Start mapping your inventory risk by demographics and tenure. If your farm area has a heavy concentration of 55 to 60 for homeowners, you should assume that normal turnover may slow if a freeze becomes available earlier. That means you may need new listing strategies that depend on life stage downsizing alone. It also means that buyer representation could become more competitive and more valuable, because scarcity markets reward professionals who can source off-market opportunities ethically, build trust, and win contracts in tight conditions. The third lesson is for builders and developers. This is a warning that the resale market may not reliably release supply when demand rises. If policy reinforces age in place, new construction becomes more important as the pressure valve for household formation. That can be an opportunity if you can deliver the right product at the right price, but it also raises the stakes of local approvals, labor constraints, and insurance costs. In practical terms, it means you should be stress testing absorption assumptions under a scenario where resale inventory remains structurally constrained, even if mortgage rates soften. The fourth lesson is for investors. Do not underwrite Texas as if it is a single, uniform story. Relief that is tied to homesteads and owner-occupants can tighten the acquisition funnel for SFR portfolios while simultaneously shaping tenant demand if prospective first-time buyers get squeezed by limited inventory. Track not just rent growth and cap rates, but the political pathway and the fiscal sustainability of relief. The Houston Chronicle has reported that Texas has authorized enormous sums of property tax relief in recent years, and that lawmakers have faced concerns about long-term costs and school funding stability, with the state promising to backfill lost revenue to keep districts whole. When public finance becomes part of your real estate thesis, your risk management has to include policy durability. Finally, the human piece, because this is where the market can either help or harm. If implemented responsibly, relief that reduces tax-driven displacement can preserve community continuity, keep older homeowners from being forced out of neighborhoods they built, and reduce the social churn that turns growth into resentment. That is not sentimental. It is economically meaningful. Stable households are better borrowers, more reliable taxpayers, and anchors for local economies. But the industry has to be honest about the trade-off. If fewer owners exit, the next generation faces a tighter gate. The social win becomes real only if the market also expands pathways for new buyers through supply, financing innovation, and honest consumer education. So here's the question I want you to sit with and answer in the comments. If Texas successfully expands tax protection at age 55 and makes ownership more hold-friendly, does that stabilize the American housing system, or does it quietly create a new class divide between people who already own and people who are still trying to get in? If you want more reporting style breakdowns like this where policy becomes market reality, hit like, subscribe, and tell me what city and country you're watching from, because your support is what keeps these videos coming, and it helps more consumers and operators see the next shift before it hits them.